Hello to everyone and welcome to this conference. I'm Guillaume Dreyer. I'm a PhD student in political economy here at the University of Geneva, and I will be chairing this opening panel, this first panel of the conference. So the conference is about planning, but in order to understand what planning is all about, it is relevant to put it in contrast with the big order of planning, which is market. And the market, as we know, has both a political, technological, and infrastructural underpinnings. And I think that this first panel will prove very useful in order to elucidate those various dimensions. The first presentation will be by Professor Julia Steinberger and is titled Climate versus Neoliberalism, Causes of Inaction and a Call for Planning. So with this reference to neoliberalism, I'm sure that the politics of market will be deeply criticized and investigated. So Julia Steinberger is a full professor at the University of Lausanne, where she teaches ecological economics and industrial ecology. She is specifically interested in the analysis of the extraction and channeling of biophysical inputs, be it planetary processes such as biodiversity or natural resource, raw materials or energy, towards social outcomes in terms of need satisfaction and human physical and emotional well-being. More precisely, she conceives of this confrontation between material inputs and social performance as being structured by specific systems of provisions, SOPs, thus putting to use a notion originally devised by Ben Fine and Ellen Leopold in their seminal 1993 book. With this concept, we are able to capture the socio-historical nature of the array of factors shaping patterns of production, distribution, and consumption. So with this theoretical underpinning, Professor Steinberger has been a principal investigator, notably in the context of her Living Well Within Limits research project conducted between 2017 and 2022, an effort that she is prolonging. She has been prolonging from 2023 onwards with the Real a Post-Growth Deal project with Professor Giorgio Callis and Jason Hickel from UAB in Barcelona. So I leave the floor to Professor Steinberger.
Thanks, and thanks also for the last minute slides. I'm just going to grab my phone. Sorry. Okay. So, all right. I'm a bit disorganized because I'm suffering from dental issues, and I will not be able to be here this afternoon because my dental issues will be resolved with surgery. I am really, really looking forward to this. So I apologize in advance for a talk that might not be as coherent as it would be ideally. So the abstract for this talk was written by Cédric and his team, and so it's a bit disjointed in terms of what I'm asked to do. I'm asked to talk about neoliberalism and the Atlas Network and stuff that I am wildly unqualified from my academic activities to talk about. The only thing I've been doing is reading books. So basically in this part of the talk, I will ask you to read books and report back from the frontier of reading these books. And then I'll talk a bit also about this research that we're doing within the REAL project, and there's some lovely people here in different places that are associated with the research team, and so they will also be able to talk more about that. Although I think also from other projects, not necessarily just from me. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of the outline. So this is my the reading list, and yeah, so all of them. You need to read all of these books to understand anything that's happening right now. This is sort of the minimum. And unfortunately, the terrible thing about any of these books is that they're written by historians. And historians, by God, like some historians are possibly in this room, I'm sorry, but like, have you ever considered writing things under 800 pages? Like, we do not need that long to get the main point. And the only one that's worse than that, is also better than that, is Jeremy Walker's More Heat Than Light. He's a philosopher of science, and it's also super long and super complicated and also super interesting, but also very relevant. So it's a bit of a mind massage. Okay, there's one thing that I really want to do here, which is I've been looking a lot at neoliberalism and the Atlas Network because I come from the climate space. And in the climate, I've been an IPCC lead author. I work on the social sciences of climate and climate mitigation. And the reason I became interested in the Atlas Network is because I learned, among others, from people like Jeremy Walker, that this was the fountainhead, the ore source, the El Dorado, the giant source of all climate disinformation. So we're battling climate disinformation, we're battling climate denial, and so I became interested in the Atlas Network because that's the place where it's all coming from. And so I wanted to know who these people were and why they're doing this. And it turns out that for them, stopping action on climate is just a hobby. That's just one of their activities. They have so many other activities, and of course their core activity is promoting neoliberal economics and neoliberal economic paradigms and ideology and either deregulation or regulation. So that's a really important thing to understand about the Atlas Network, is that they're doing all this stuff, but climate denial and disinformation is just part of it. The second thing I think that's important to understand is that when we're dealing with neoliberalism and the people who fund them, because without the funders, the ideas are nothing. And the Atlas Network is the best example of the funding and the ideas coming together, is that the ideas and the funders shape each other. So you have the Montpellier Society on the one hand, who are the thinkers and the intellectuals and those sort of semi-respectable people. And then you have the funders who are helping fund the think tanks that disseminate the ideas, like the Atlas Network. But the funders shape the intellectuals, and they shape the ideas. And the ideology is very much influenced by what the funders are willing to support. So neoliberalism is not a pure ideology, and you should never think of it as such. And that's one of the things that globalists, I think, that Quinn Slobodian's book that Cedric was just talking about really shows, is how what the dominant strains and the strains that became most implemented in neoliberalism are not necessarily ideologically pure, market competition. They're very much what the funders wanted instrumentally to see happen. And so you should not think of neoliberalism as a pure economic ideology. You should think about it as a political alliance. And that's another thing that Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's latest book, The Big Myth, how many of you have read it? Thank you. But everybody in this room needs to read it. Am I correct? I think so, yeah. So because they cover they don't cover just like, since the 1950s and the rise of neoliberalism. They don't just cover like Quinn Slobodian since the 1920s, and not just Hayek, but von Mises and so on. They go 150 years back. They go to the 1800s, and they talk about the role of industrial lobbies like the National Manufacturers Association of Manufacturers, which still exists in the U.S. And they talk about how these industrial lobby groups advocate for social and environmental deregulation forever. They're fighting labor unions. They're fighting environmental regulation. They want child labor. They still want child labor. They're trying to deregulate to get child labor right now because Trump's immigration crackdown is cutting down on their low-cost labor, so they want immigrant children to be able to work in a factory. This is happening right. It's still the same organization. They have incredible continuity, okay? And one of the things that The Big Myth, I think, shows quite convincingly, at least I'm convinced, is that neoliberalism is an opportunistic marriage of these industrial interests and their continued agenda. What matters is their agenda. The ideas are a vehicle, okay? The ideology and how popular it can be is a vehicle. That's really important to understand. Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, shows who these families are that are doing the funding. And one of the things that they do, and I think is really important to understand, is that the deregulation that neoliberalism claims to want is very much deregulation for us, like deregulation in terms of social and environmental quality, right? and regulation for them. They don't care about market freedom as much as they want to impose their market dominance through regulation, internationally, like Cedric mentioned, with the WTO, and also very much nationally. And so Jay Meyer's book, Dark Money, talks about how they funded, the funders were very interested in this and funded this new field of economic law, which is now now dominating in a lot of places. In Democracy in Chains, Nancy McLean does a biography of James Buchanan, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics for being a very terrible person, as far as I could tell. It's one way to get there. Social choice theory, I think, is the official name of it. He co-wrote, he doesn't get enough credit for this. He went down to Chile and stayed with the junta for 6 to 7 weeks to co-write the Chilean constitution under Pinochet. So he was very much persuaded that his ideology of hierarchy and inequality and authoritarianism needed regulation, okay? So when they say they don't want regulation, it's very selective. Always remember that. All right, so now I'll sort of get into my talk. So I think that these books, for this audience, I think that The Big Myth is really important to understand the long history of this stuff and who's been involved and how they've done it. In particular, Globalist, Democracy in Chains, and Dark Money are important for understanding the regulatory aspect of it, how they want regulation for them, for their interests. Okay, that's maybe another point. Okay, so what I did is more than a year ago at this point, I read a bunch of books, some of these books, and I wrote this blog. So basically, a lot of what will be in this content, because who has time for academic papers anymore? And anyway, I'm not qualified to write this, so I wrote it in blog form. I tried to make it entertaining. I tried to make it short because, help us, historians are not going to do this for us, right? So I tried to make it something digestible. And basically, one of the things I learned through this reading is that the market ideals, the market ideology, is a smokescreen for a political program. And the political program is anti-democracy, it is anti-equality, okay? So when we say neoliberalism is an economic ideology, that's wrong. It's at its core about hierarchy and imposing hierarchy and maintaining hierarchy in societies. Basically, Hayek and his friends were persuaded that the only society that works is one where you have strong hierarchy. Economically through competition, and home, the societal level he doesn't believe in, so we get rid of that. Wendy Brown's book is absolutely fundamental here. But that's why at the family level it should be traditional patriarchy. There is no contradiction between neoliberalism and the traditional family values because the goal is hierarchy, okay? And hierarchy because Hayek was persuaded that democracy would result in appeals to social justice, and social justice would lead to authoritarianism. Not like the kind of authoritarianism he loved, like Pinochet, but another kind of authoritarianism that he didn't love so much, like the Soviet Union. Okay, and this is what we now get as sort of the family photographs of this alliance, right? And this anti-democratic aspect. So you have best friends, Thatcher and Pinochet. They were really best friends. She invited him to her, cottage or whatever, summer home. So he was, he got to impose these ideologies at the bullet of the gun, and she got to do it through the ballot box, thanks to the very first Atlas Network think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, founded by Anthony Fisher. And so that, it is very much an anti-democratic project. Now we have Musk and Millet, who are sort of the current version of that. Charles Koch and James Buchanan, obviously. So Charles Koch funded James Buchanan's career. James Buchanan was the guy who wrote the Chilean Constitution. So they were also quite good buddies. He wasn't very fond of the camera, which is why we don't have pictures of this. And this is the magazine of the Atlas Network. And the Atlas Network has a magazine, and they call it Freedom's Champion because they believe in individuals carrying the ideology forward. And you see Millet here. So that's sort of the family picture we're looking at. I think it's really important to understand this alliance of money and ideology. Okay. So I'm going to skip over a bunch of stuff because Cedric already talked about it very well, except maybe here the only thing I'll do is note that Hayek's Bastards is really important to understand, which is his latest book. He writes too many books, but his books are fairly readable, I have to say that for him. it shows how neoliberal ideology is influencing the far right. The neoliberal ideologues originally would not have agreed with fascism themselves. That was not their thing. But the neo-fascists very much are influenced by neoliberal ideology. And it's important to understand that and how it's being taken forward. And it's a book that reading it made me physically ill, so just be aware. Because he goes into the whole race science stuff, which is quite stomach-turning. Okay, what does this mean? So I think this is important to think about. What does this mean in terms of our current time in the European Union? So Cedric just talked about how we're seeing a new kind of a desire for government intervention in the economy, but the form it's taking, I would say, has very strong neoliberal tendencies. If we look at the Draghi report and the competitiveness compass that is driving European Union policy right now, it's very much focused, it's putting forward these neoliberal ideas of competition, deregulation, it's full-on rollback of climate, environmental, labor, and social efforts. Remember, the primary enemy of all of these people are labor unions, right? That's the group that they hate the most. And possibly something that has slightly less focus on it, has been paid less attention, but there's a real, within the Draghi report, there's specific technologies being highlighted. And those technologies are not neutral technologies, not that any technology possibly ever is, but they're definitely not oriented towards climate or health or anything like that. They're very aligned with what these groups in the US are pushing in terms of AI, space, and militarization, right? So this is all sort of happening at once. And I'm going to skip this because we talked about it. I do want to talk about the new twists because I think AI is important and cryptocurrency is important. And I wish that we didn't have to talk about them. They bore me to heck. They annoy me I realize that nobody wants new problems on top of all the problems we have, like fascism, inequality, planetary destruction. But I think we need to pay attention to these. So this is my plea to Sergey. Welcome. I think that we do have to pay attention to these technologies. So one of the things to understand is that these technologies come with ideologies behind them. The reason that the tech bros and the Silicon billionaires went into these topics and did these investments to start with often have ideological roots. There are political projects behind these technologies, okay? And one of the most influential of these ideologies is the network state, the idea that you can take power away from the government and you can make these sort of privatized networks of states with their own currency, their own territory, their own laws, and they're trying to make this happen, and that's also the topic of another of Quinn Slobodian's book, Crack Up Capitalism. So basically the network state is driving a lot of what these people are doing. Cryptocurrencies are important as a vehicle for corruption, private industry corruption. They cannot be regulated, and they're also a way to discipline government. The state cannot control them. The state has no transparency and overview on them, and so they can't be taxed, right? In the same way that normal transactions can be taxed. So they're a way to threaten the power of the state, and that means that the state then has to negotiate or give in to, as in the case of the US right now, the cryptocurrency industry. Artificial intelligence has a different target. I would say that the goal of artificial intelligence is to discipline labor. Whether or not they really succeed in replacing labor, the threat is there. And that means that they can basically convince different actors to treat labor in a very different way. So there's a whole bunch of ideology behind AI itself. These wonderful people, Tim McDebreu and Emile Torres, wrote a paper to explain these ideologies to us called the TESCREAL bundle. Every single letter in TESCREAL corresponds to a specific ideology. So it's kind of a rat's nest mess, right? One of the main things to understand behind these ideologies is that they're anti-human. They think that humans are just like an intermediate stage in the evolution of real intelligence. And they're anti-planet. They think that they can just go to space and leave Earth behind, and that any action, any political position, any regulation that prevents generalized artificial intelligence from reaching out into space has to be stopped with violence, okay? Is a threat to the most exalted direction the human destiny can take. Now, I realize I sound crazy for even saying that, but these people happen to be in charge right now. This is Musk's ideology that I've just described, okay? And so I think it's really important that we engage with what these crazy people are saying and doing, and I really would recommend Gil Durant's Nerdreich and Emil Torres and Kate Willick have a very nice podcast called Dystopia Now, because I think we need to be more aware of these things. Okay. I've written about this. I'm trying to call it cataclysm capitalism. I think it's a new form of capitalism, and capitalism always has new forms. But one of the things that's really important to understand is a lot of these tech billionaires, they also had experiences during the financial crisis that were formative, and during COVID that were formative to their thinking. And they think they can survive crises. They think that they don't need a prosperous economy. So even the baseline common belief that you need a prosperous, stable economy to be okay is gone for these people, okay? And they've learned to profit from disruption and destruction. They are fine with it. So, and they also know from experience that immiserated populations will endure exploitative working conditions, et cetera. So the thing is just understand that like any kind of social consensus with these people is pretty gone. And I think that that's just important to keep up with that reality. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. Maybe I'll not skip this one. This, just because the global Sumud flotilla is under attack right now. It's on its way, as hopefully everybody knows, to Gaza. A very beautiful thing happened. Italy, who's Italian here? Okay, well, you can be proud to be from Italy today, because there was a general strike for Gaza, and it forced the government. It was massive, and it wasn't covered in the news anywhere else, as far as I can tell, because general strikes are very scary. And it forced the government to dispatch a ship to protect the flotilla. Spain is also dispatching a ship. But I really, really loved this quote by Thiago Avila, who is a climate and humanitarian activist, as well as here with Greta Thunberg, who's also on the flotilla, who said, it's amazing to see that when we decide to do something together, we go beyond that idea that we cannot do anything, that our only mission, our only capacity is to work, and compete, and accumulate material goods. We have the capacity to achieve great accomplishments once we put collective action and collective intelligence to work. And I thought that that was a beautiful and very much anti-neoliberal statement to put forward, and we need this kind of different vision. Okay, so I'm sorry about the skipping around. You must remember that I am in limited condition. But one of the directions that we're putting forward, and this is where we join very much the discussion around planning, is that if we want to counter this trend that has many, many different unpleasant faces, from fascism to race science to the Silicon Valley tech brothers, who are very much far right and eugenicists, by the way, and this new economic direction, is that democracy has to be put forward. So neoliberalism at its core is an anti-democratic project. The actors that support neoliberalism are anti-democratic as well. The Atlas Network is polluting, is an anti-democratic effort. So the Atlas Network is a network of about 500 think tanks that are supported by this core of the Atlas Network, that put forward neoliberal ideas, put forward climate disinformation, and they engage in culture wars as long as they can be anti-state. It's kind of fun. They can be on either side of the culture wars. And all they do is communication. They don't really do any independent research. And they've been very much enmeshed in our media landscapes and our political landscape. If anybody's from New Zealand, the acting Prime Minister of New Zealand for a while was a pure Atlas Network product. That was interesting. And they're not just going against climate science, but they're also going against the university in general, because they see the university and university research as information in the public interest. And so that's one of the things that they're trying to counter. So they're trying to undermine not just the role of climate scientists, but the role of the university full stop, and put forward their personas as sort of private sector experts And so I think that this is one of the things that we should take seriously as researchers and put forward not just our research, but our research in the service of democracy as being quite important. Okay, and now, Guillaume, how many minutes should I have left? Like -3? I still no. I question your timekeeping. All right, so that gives me a few minutes. I'll take a few minutes anyway to talk about some research results from the Living Well Within Limits project, which I was lucky enough to acquire in the UK back when I was at the University of Leeds, and the REAL project, Real a Post-Growth Deal, which is a European project. And I should say that getting these projects was not easy. It took anybody who has had failed grants, I had 10 years of failed grants before getting the first one. So I had other projects, but they weren't my projects that I cared about. So it's been very nice getting these. It's been a bit of an uphill battle, and hopefully we can help other people. More and more people are finally able to get some funding to do this. Okay. And as Guillaume said in his very nice introduction, we do use provisioning and provisioning systems as a core object in our research. We're trying to understand the links between resource use and well-being, and provisioning as social, political, and technical objects, as well as economic objects, are really important in our research, and that's what we're trying to understand better. And you mentioned Ben Fine, which is great because I had the slide too. So we have this huge intellectual debt to Ben Fine, where indeed there was the Fine and Leopold book that started it, and right now there's a very nice book that was written partly thanks to our project by Kate Bayless and Ben Fine, where this system of provision approach that we are able to use to do this kind of research is described, as well as some of the results that from Kate's research. Okay, and so this is sort of our sort of headline result in a sense, is that provisioning systems could enable good lives at low resource use. Like, we can do the modeling, we can do the math. I'll show you some of that in a second. But we know that technologically it's possible to provide decent living standards for everybody at low resource use. You can sort of do that math. But in fact, our provisioning systems are engineered differently, and this is where we see the fact that this idea of deregulation and competition is very selective, right? That it applies to some cases but not to others, because what we see is we see that provisioning systems are engineered to create resource dependency. And perhaps no example is better than the US car system, right? Because you really see regulatory imposition of car dependency in so many different ways. We wrote about some of them in this paper read by Giulio Maccioli on the political economy of car dependency. So one of the things that we basically found and demonstrated is that dependence on resource-intensive consumption is itself an industrial product. When you look at what industry is doing over the last couple of hundred years, they're imposing dependence on resource-intensive consumption. And it's driven by decades of lobbying, subsidies, and state regulatory capture. Okay, so this idea that the consumer is choosing this or that is very questionable. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to insult you with the cartoons. I will give this quote because I think it's nice. This is Philip Alston, who was UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, on his UK visit report, based on our research, especially on Kate Bayless's research, saying, abandoning people to the private market in relation to services that affect every dimension of their basic well-being without guaranteeing their access to minimum standards is incompatible with human rights requirements. And I think that that's a pretty strong call for planning. Of course, the UK government then was like, nah, we don't believe you're right. There's no poverty here. Go away. And nothing happened. Okay, so, all right. So this is the analytic framework we chose within the Living Well Within Limits project. You have your natural resources, your provisioning systems, your social outcomes. And I'm just going to show a couple of results that are fun. One of the things that's fun is, this is a result from Yepine Fogel's PhD. And we identified, I realize that this is like in the middle of a lot of people. Anyway, socioeconomic factors enabling well-being at lower energy use. So this is a quantitative study, international. We find positive factors being public services, including healthcare, equality of income, democracy, and any kind of access to network infrastructure. So again, we can make economies that work better for people and allow well-being at lower resource use. Negative factors are extractivism and economic growth above a moderate income. This result was taken up by the IPCC, which was fun. And we think that this idea of democratizing economic provisioning systems is really important. So it's not just about state control. It's about who gets to make decisions about the most important aspect of our lives. Who gets to make decisions about production, consumption, use, work. And I think that this is something that we need to think about in a much more granular and specific way, so have a look at that paper if you want to. I'll just show you, just this result is fun. So this is a result from the REAL project by Leah Tamberg's research. It's a preprint, so you can find it on the internet. But basically, the title says it all. Human need satisfaction enables decoupling of well-being from income. So she was able to show that if you have need satisfaction, then economic growth and income really don't have any effect anymore, which is kind of cool. And so that's a nice result. And yeah, so this is just to show you the math bit of the Living Well Within Limits project. So decent living energy, so the energy requirements for decent living standards for everybody, single, every man, child, woman, elderly person, everybody, would be, in 2050, including population growth, would be possible at 40% to less than half of current energy use, which is pretty cool. So that's nice. It's a how low can you go, but it's nice to know that we could get there within our current, very much within our current system. Now, this is important to the planning debate, is that we need a lot of investment to get there. And this is investment not in monetary terms, but in energy terms, because we are a biophysical modeling community. This is a result by Jarmo Kikstra and colleagues, including Narasimha Rao. And one of the things that Jarmo did, which is beautiful, is he estimated the amount of energy that would be necessary to invest to get to everybody to this decent living energy point. And the investment is about 300 exajoules, which is a lot and entirely doable. And most of it is in the domain of shelter. This is housing and appliances. After investment, look how, this is the annual use after investment. Look how tiny small shelter is. So the point is, we pour a huge amount of our effort, work, resources into the center of people where they live. We can actually allow them to live with a lot lower energy use. But this requires, for sure, planning, and it's very much not aligned with the militarization, AI, and space agenda, right? So I will leave things there. Oh yeah, I really wanted to encourage everybody here to join the Climate Social Science Network. It's run out of Brown University by lovely colleagues. Here is, you can just sort of see the face of Timmons Roberts, who sort of launched it. He's a beloved colleague of mine. And you can everybody can join. They're being attacked by the fossil fuel interests. They're being attacked by the Trump administration, and they're coming out with these amazing books. This one's already available, Climate Obstruction Across Europe, and Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment will be coming out in October. And I would think that we should all join this effort and stand with them. And thank you so much, and I'm sorry about the scattered talk and time.
Thank you to Professor Steinberger for this presentation. We will now be listening to Professor Edward Nika. So Edward Nika is Professor of Economics at Roanoke College. He is widely recognized for his work on the history of information and the genesis of the integration of this concept into economics, as well as on the successive shifts in its framing. Among his many publications on this subject, some fundamental outputs of this research program are contained in his book, co-authored with Philip Mirowski, The Knowledge We Have Lost in Information, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Professor Nika has also written extensively on market design and his work on the subject was recognized with the Khah William Cap Award from the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. More recently, he has extended his reflections on this issue by analyzing how the development of platforms by technology companies has reorganized economists' theoretical constructs and, to some extent, their professional practices. In this respect, he has been able to show in a recent contribution for the Journal of Economic Methodology that the unfolding of those technological infrastructures has prompted the sometimes implicit reconceptualization of what is to be understood by the category of market and how agents are thought to be behaving through market transactions. This reconceptualization having the potential through a performative loop to shape the further development of the technological infrastructures sustaining the contemporary organization of the social world. So I now leave the floor to Professor Khah for his presentation, which is titled The Great Transformation of Markets, Lesson from the History of Market Design.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, thanks so much for inviting me, Cedric. Thank you for the invitation. Hey, you remember when markets were going to save us? See, I do. From Kyoto through Paris and beyond Paris, markets took center stage for those who wanted to use like institutional design in order to address the climate crisis. The UK, the EU, the US, parts of it at least, instituted carbon markets. China got on board. Swaths of the commentariat endorsed these measures, thought this would be the best hope for addressing the climate crisis. Environmental advocacy groups signed on themselves. So did oil companies, right? They got on board with this too. Even neoliberal think tanks got on board with instituting carbon markets, at least for a while, and when they weren't promoting outright denialism or geoengineering. We actually might want to come talk about that again here shortly. Economists enthused about carbon markets as well, and they even offered to build them. Disciplinary groups traditionally opposed to economics, see, they got on board too, and they wanted to get into the act. Okay, so a conviction developed among all these different groups that opposing markets was a waste of time, that it would be better to engineer them. But the consensus might be cracking now, okay? But people do keep saying the same thing about neoliberalism, okay? So maybe that should give us a little bit of pause. What I'm going to do in what follows is consider the relationship between market design and neoliberalism. But I'd like to step back, okay? I'd like to step back and consider the appeal of these different forms of pro-market arguments. And I'm going to pan out. I'm going to discuss links between the history of market design and the history of neoliberalism. And then I want to draw some conclusions from this shared history. Okay, so look, if you want to draw lessons from the history of the employment of carbon markets, get in line, okay, because lots of people have done this sort of thing. There's a moderately large literature on the use of economics in things like cap and trade, okay? What's interesting about it is that it tends to hew to a single storyline, okay? And I'm going to try to give you a sense of what this history is. So first, the intellectual roots of cap and trade lay with concern of economists about externalities. So like these are commodities that have these troublesome characteristics that obstruct the proper operation of the market. Once upon a time, following A.C. Pigou, these economists might have called for the government to impose a tax to curtail pollution. But with the intellectual innovations of Ronald Coase, then they came around to using bargaining in order to do the same thing. And ultimately, they came around to constructing markets in order to accomplish the same. So Coase's ideas first assumed political salience in the United States. The US government came around to acknowledge the possibility of employing markets with a few decades lag, some legislative horse trading, a receptive Republican administration. An emissions trading scheme was put into place for sulfur dioxide. That was in 1990. And so consequently, and I'm continuing with this shared history, okay, consequently, economists were given license to act as policy entrepreneurs and to run economic experiments. And this culminated in, among other things, the European markets for climate emissions. As far as the role of economics in all of that, this history portrays market design as a natural outgrowth of 1950s vintage welfare economics. There are a couple of problems with this history, I would say. One problem is that it overstates or at least misunderstands the role of economics in parts of the history. So I'll just, for example, market designers actually complained that they weren't consulted in constructing the sulfur dioxide market that kind of was the first application of this approach. Okay. Now, economists certainly did participate in the construction of carbon markets and markets for other forms of emissions. Just to give you an example, they were involved in the setup of the 2002 UK auction. It was in the wake of this stunning notoriety that market designers had received for auctioning off public assets. So that accounts for the timing, why they got brought in a little bit later. But I kind of want to focus on something else rather than getting that portion of the history right. I'd like to pose a couple of questions. Like, what was it that they designed? And to what end? Okay, see, this might sound obvious to you, right? Like, of course they want to reduce emissions, okay? But hold on. Let's talk our way through this. Entertain me, okay? Are we talking about a generic market beset by externalities, which would imply that the purpose would be to intervene to restore markets to this quasi-natural state of Pareto optimality? Okay, that could be one goal. Was the goal to build a new kind of market capable of revealing knowledge, say via prices of abatement? That's another goal, okay? Was it to help participants learn their own values for such abatement? Was it to institute a discovery procedure for new knowledge, such as new methods of production that would result in abatement? Was it to corral a harmful market, a political market whereby rents were captured by powerful interess, harming abatement efforts? Was that the purpose of instituting a market? And I want to say that advocates of using markets have advanced all of these claims, and sometimes multiple claims at the same time. I might add another one. Perhaps the very point of establishing an emissions market might be to prevent the necessary structural adjustments to deal effectively with global warming. See, that's a possibility as well, right? These are distinct possibilities, and they're grounded in fundamentally different understandings of what markets are and what markets can accomplish. Absent some specificity about what the market is and what it's supposed to do in a given political situation, the point of employing a market, well, it becomes lost. Okay, and the reason that I'm making so much of this is that this is bedeviled efforts to draw lessons from the employment of market design by not only economists, but many people that kind of want to re-engineer markets to come up with better, kind of more humane outcomes than economists might be inclined to provide. In short, it's only superficially that market designers are committed to a novel way of addressing the problem of externalities. In a much more fundamental way, market design has undermined and dissolved the welfare economics that undergirds judgments of market failure. So, if we want to discover the point of the employment of markets, I would say that we can't just focus on the case of emissions permits and things like that. We have to pan out, Okay? We have to pan out beyond the well-known arguments of Ronald Coase, and we have to focus on events that had a much more profound impact on the economics profession, of which market design was its most visible mark. Not its only effect, but its most visible mark. And there's really no getting around it. What we're going to have to do is talk about planning in order to do this. Okay, so economists stumbled upon the conviction that they might construct ideal marks over the course of a long history of political controversies over the viability of socialism. So this is a well-known sequence of events. I won't belabor the point, but during the interwar period, Austrian economists such as Friedrich Hayek kicked off something called the socialist calculation controversy. And he argued that government planners can never know enough in order to plan any reasonably elaborate economic system. By the 1940s, the neoliberal argument was being promoted by international members of the Pelerin Society, which we talked about just a moment ago, while in the United States, their opponents were primarily located at something called the Coles Commission. Now, the Coles Commission was housed from 1938 to 1952 at the University of Chicago. This isn't the Chicago school. The Chicago school hated these people, okay? And after then, they decamped for Yale. So the economists at Coles had interpreted Hayek as arguing the relative merits of free markets over socialism on informational grounds. And they found the argument wanting. So Leonid Hurwitz, and it's called, oh, by the way, Hayek, Hurwitz. This guy was trying to argue against Hayek. Okay, that's Leonid Hurwitz. He argued that the purpose was to reconceive their own task as the evaluation of the information properties of economic systems, okay? But they would claim that the methods that they developed to argue against Hayek, to evaluate these systems, could inform choice among a plethora of institutions. And they began to contemplate designing new institutions. So institutions ranging from novel legal regimes to solutions for public goods provision to the reorganization of like entire economies. Okay, so they're thinking about everything here. Now, in what turned out to be the most significant development, they would eventually also claim an ability to reconstruct individual markets themselves. And this is what paved the way to what eventually became known within the economics profession as market design. What followed was an upheaval in the practice of economics. So since roughly 1980, the profession converged upon a much more constructivist approach to markets. So before, economists might have contemplated markets from like a space detached from their subject matter, right? Kind of looking down on them and reporting. But now they would be found like in the trenches alongside other participants engaged in making and shaping markets. Okay. Economists began turning out a variety of devices, of hitherto undreamt market forms for space shuttle payload launches, airline scheduling, the organization of wireless communications, and electricity markets. But if markets are conceived as constructed entities, then they can be skewed in order to favor certain participants. This was really the very first lesson that market designers took to heart. So, what I've got up here is a quote taken from Charles Plott. I know that the date on there says 2001, but what he's doing is he's reporting on a sequence of events that dated back to the end of the 1970s. Okay? So a colleague of his who was trained in the Chicago law and economics tradition got pulled into the government in order to deregulate airlines. And Plott and some of his colleagues came in and designed a market to do it. I mean, it actually didn't get employed, but for the present purposes, that's not what was important. What was important was that right off the bat, a lesson that they learned was that it would be possible to tinker with the rules in order to skew markets and the outcomes favored by the person that is bringing the market into use, okay? So the important upshot of this is that market design contradicts the idea of a transparent and unbiased market mechanism. This isn't like just me saying it. This was a result that was arrived at internally from the profession. Okay? Okay, so market design has often been called neoliberal, and there's good reason to think of it as neoliberal. The events depicted on the last slide were really bound up with deregulation, okay? So there are good reasons for thinking about it in that way. And yet, most economists, particularly market designers, wouldn't agree with the label, right? So they believe that they managed to retain the stuff from the good Hayek, right? The Hayek that wanted to talk about the economic importance of information, right? That's the good Hayek. I mean, that stimulated bodies of thought and traditions in the field, okay? While at the same time keeping the bad politics at bay. Okay, so I've given you a quote. This is Robert Solow, famous economist who gives a voice to exactly this kind of idea. But he's not alone in thinking this. So, I'd just like to ask the question, what, if anything, about market design is related to Hayek? Right, it'd actually be good to know, wouldn't it? One answer is that he shares with Hayek the view that markets don't exist to allocate physical resources so much as they serve to integrate and disseminate something called knowledge, right? So that's one thing it shares. Here's another thing that it shares. It would attribute to Hayek the very idea that a market can be designed, okay? Hayek championed the construction of a properly designed competitive order. He talked about this a lot. And both of these ideas are true, but they're incomplete. Additionally, Hayek's epistemology ended up leaving traces on the economics profession as a whole, and particularly upon market design. Okay, sorry for the big quote, okay, but I've only put in orange the things I really want you to pay attention to, okay? All right. What remains of the socialist calculation controversy and the mental maps of today's economists is found in Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society. And the message there is aptly summarized by the article's most famous passage. So I've given you the passage here. The part that you'll see repeated again and again and again within the economics literature is particularly the stuff in the orange. So I'm sure that all of you have encountered it before, okay? Everyone talks about this article, okay? Everyone does. But it's mostly escaped notice that it was not until rather late in his career that he connected this idea to a theory of information dispersal. And again, this is by his own admission. Eventually, Hayek comes around to the view that knowledge did not really persist at the level of the individual mind. Rather, it was invested with meaning and process at this suprapersonal level. To put it slightly differently, the only entity that could really judge and validate human knowledge was the market. Not only could much human knowledge be unable to be retrieved from within the individual by the person in question, but there's like this type of knowledge that isn't known by the human being at all. Okay, a funny kind of knowledge, huh? Yeah, this is what he argues, okay? Well then, okay, if no one knows it, who knows it? Or what knows it? Actually, it's a what that we're talking about here, because the what is the market. The market is the thing that knows the knowledge that you can't know. It is this super information processor that knows more than any human being can. I have to say, this is one of those ideas that once you say it out loud, you don't necessarily know where it's going to take you. And we may want to talk about this a little bit later, but this directly connects to the neoliberal hostility to things like the public university, or even the scientific community being allowed on its own to vet knowledge claims. It's not the subject of this talk so much, but it may be important for us to think this through and talk about it later, okay? Okay, so there's Hayek's argument, and now back to the people who initially thought of themselves as antagonists of Hayek's arguments. They were spurred by Hayek, and economists now began to grapple with what looked like seemingly technical notions of information, not the loosey-goosey stuff that Hayek was talking about, right? Okay, he's talking about knowledge, he's wordy and all of that. We're going to deal with formal notions of information. But a funny thing happens, okay? This ended up bringing about changes in what it meant to know something, both for the agent that the economist was studying and for the economic analyst herself, okay? And ironically, this leads them to adopt a different position. They relinquish the position that information was like this unalloyed good. The more information, the better, okay, for agents, in favor of this idea that economic actors often are and perhaps even should be ignorant. Okay. They almost invariably express this idea via information processing. And so I could give you a ton of quotes that do this, but I've given you two different ones here. So the first one comes from the economist Vernon Smith. If you know Vernon Smith, you might think of him as an experimental economist. He's a really, really early person on board this idea of market design. He gets there very early. So what we have in this first quote, the objective of market design is to combine information advantages of decentralized ownership with coordination advantages of central processing. We solved the socialist calculation controversy. How? By building smart markets. Not my term, actually. This is a term of art now. Like, what a perfect term for this idea, right? You can't do the thinking. So we need to offload thinking to markets who can handle these kind of complex issues of sorting through. Well, of sorting through what? Actually, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Are we just talking about allocation? Probably not, since now the subject of economics is information. Complexity we can't deal with must be offloaded onto the market. Okay. Economists would now regard markets as person-machine systems. Again, not my term. This is the term that's in circulation. Although human persons were involved in some way in their operation, the responsibility for thinking offloaded. And like, you know, what a term, right? Expresses these ideas of Hayek that epistemically compromised agents would need to delegate matters of thinking and choice to the market. Okay? Some promoted this idea as an artifact of computational techniques. So you come across this, okay, computing power increases, we're going to obviously use more computers. Why wouldn't we? It would be foolish not to. But see, what I would argue here is that it traces in a much deeper way to this epistemic rupture that was caused by the socialist calculation controversy. This view was highly compatible with the idea that markets can know things that agents cannot. So highly compatible with Hayek's ideas, as expressed later in his life. So even though economists have kind of convinced themselves that they've come to grip with Hayek's concerns, see, I would argue that the ghost of Hayek still haunts them, whether they realize it or not. Okay, so by the 1990s, the aspiration of economists and policymakers converged on the task of thoroughly reorganizing the institutions of the economic life world, from bottom to top. Market designers offered to lend a hand with their expertise. Usually they did for a price. They set up consultancies in order to do so. They patented markets, okay? You can actually get a patent on a market. Did you know that? Isn't that strange? Policymakers would increasingly take them up on the offer. Not only in the US, worldwide, this happens now. And this convergence wasn't an accident. Both policymaker and economists came to appreciate how real-world markets increasingly resembled information processors. Both adjusted their aspirations in light of this. both would come to attribute immense epistemic capabilities to these new markets. As a practical matter, this justified piecemeal marketization and ultimately full privatization. As a theoretical matter, this served to degrade the cognitive capacities of the agent. So market design really turned out to be a perfect fit for its time. And the reason it was such a perfect fit is because it takes the precepts of neoliberalism to their logical conclusion. Okay? Now the market is not merely an information processor. I mean, of course markets are like they're computerized. You'd have to be blind not to see that. But see, it's not just that. They're omnipotent processors of information. You know, that than which no greater can be conceived, okay? The very, very top. They're somehow more transparent than bureaucracy, okay? You've probably heard that one before. But yet at the same time, they're too opaque to leave to democratic deliberation, right? The public is incapable of comprehending, like incapable of comprehending the operation of markets. And as market participants, people are regarded as the weak link. It's a complex technology, they're the weak link. Their severe cognitive limitations pose a clear threat to its proper functioning. So consequently, markets are less and less about giving people what they want and increasingly about operating regardless of what it is that people think they want. So market design inadvertently, I would say, but nevertheless did undermine and dissolve the prior welfare economics upon which older judgments of market failures depended. And an externality is a form of a market failure. If people didn't know what they wanted, I mean, what sense would it make to say that there was some thing out there that could give it to them, right? In that sense, it was undermined. So market design espouses this position that markets work, but we can make them work better somehow. But the markets that were made to work better weren't your grandparents' markets. They were these immensely complicated algorithmic procedures. They're offered in the spirit of a reliable technology that could be put into place of other methods of governance that had previously depended on this woefully unreliable human component. Consequently, anywhere that people gathered to resolve anything, lurking was a candidate for market design. I'm so happy that the platform came up in our last talk because that actually is directly relevant. That's right. I mean, the platform, big tech, really matters for both kind of the self-identified neoliberals and for market design in fundamental ways today. I need to think about how much I want to do. How much time do I have? Beautiful, 10 minutes. All right, so we'll talk about this a little bit. I just want to say this. The advent of the platform really supercharged these trends that I've been talking about so far. So Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon were foremost among an exploding roster of firms that would approach economists and bring a professional pipeline to Seattle and Silicon Valley. And this would further bloat the definition of markets. So there's something funny that's happening here. What the market is undergoing change over time, and it's becoming more and more and more bloated until actually, if we get to today, it encompasses everything that, say, a platform could possibly do. That now gets redefined as a market. Okay. The result here was the most ambitious program in the history of economics. Like, I mean it, okay? Installing a Pigouvian tax, engaging in a bit of macroeconomic fine-tuning, heck, even thorough economy-wide central planning. That's nothing compared to this, I would say. It's quaint by comparison, because market designers are now offering to assume responsibility for reconstructing all of society from bottom to top. They participated in offering to construct a new technology of knowledge collation and ratification, a new technology of decision, a giant machine. They created consultancies to do this sort of work. And for especially complex situations such as spectrum license allocation and electricity markets, they offered to devise boutique markets made to order, sometimes patented. So this is like the spectrum plan for the US, okay? And allocating is hard because there are all sorts of disjoint packages that are supposed to be allocated. It's a problem in combinatorial optimization, and the mathematics is frighteningly complex in doing this. I had a hard time finding any such representation of like the smart grid, okay? But that's complex too, for all sorts of physical reasons, as well as organizational reasons. But the ratcheting up of this complexity creates big problems for the operation of the market. There's this great new book by Georg Rillinger on this called Failure by Design on electricity markets that makes exactly this point. The profit motive can give incentives for undermining the market's operation. And so as complexities multiply, then there's a lot more opportunity for gamesmanship. And the only way to harness that from the standpoint of the designer, ironically, for the purposes of our discussion here, is to exert more control on what the participants do. Okay? At the same time, the profit motive can encourage tinkering with the market format, which results in the rollout of ever more complex markets. So see, complexity isn't necessarily a natural feature that we're talking about here. It may come from the designers themselves, whether it be economics or adjacent disciplines such as finance. And this work of rolling out and dealing with complexity is potentially never done. In the case of climate markets, it may result in new markets to trade offsets, new markets for derivatives, and so on and so on. Even if these measures result in leakages and dubious offsets and outright fraud, economists would not counsel the replacement of these markets with, say, bureaucratic decision-making. Okay? Instead, these practical failures serve as invitations to roll out yet more elaborate markets. That's been the trend. Okay? So this is one way that market design remains consistent with neoliberalism. Okay? The technical economist agrees with the think tanker that when it comes to handling information, markets cannot fail. They may have little setbacks, but they can't ultimately fail. Market design also dovetails with what is often called solutionism. Okay? So some designers have come out, just right out in favor of solar geoengineering. Okay? Vernon Smith, who you saw earlier, he's part of this Bjorn Lomborg's climate Copenhagen consensus, right? And as a member of that group, they said solar geoengineering, gives you a lot of bang for the buck, okay? Things like carbon taxes, boo, because they're expensive, right? It's way at the bottom. Plus, it takes the state in order to come up with an idea of how much of a tax to place on carbon. So at the level of ideas, that's a problem from the standpoint of the neoliberal thinker, okay? But others take a different tack. So carbon dioxide removal, to some, isn't quite so scary. So I've given you a picture of carbon dioxide removal here. You've got these big fans. There's lots of ways of doing it, right? But the picture I gave you is kind of the fun one to look at, where all these fans are supposed to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and then hopefully store it in a place that it wouldn't get re-released the next forest fire or something like that. Okay? And they're joined. They're joined by many different sorts of parties. They're joined by big oil states, and digital platforms have gotten on board. So Microsoft and Google have promoted such technologies as precisely the same time that their consumption of energy is exploding, and probably for exactly that reason. Now, the market designers have arrived at the position that the big problem with carbon dioxide removal is the absence of a market. Only markets could develop and scale CDR technologies. Okay, so see, another reason for using markets. Here, a bit of design can help support scientific research and scale up an innovation. I don't know, maybe it can, right? That's their argument. Or maybe this also teaches us something about neoliberalism. See, neoliberals aren't merely a bunch of like austerity scolds, nor are they exactly anti-science. We actually might want to talk about this. A lot of them, I mean, some of them are kind of denialists, right? You know them, they're the public ones. But a lot of them seek to forge relations with members of scientific communities. And there are a lot of such cases. I've written a lot on how they've done it with pharma. But they've done it here as well, okay? And in many different areas. So oftentimes neoliberalism comes in the name of science. And it accuses you of bounding a Promethean science. See, if you don't want research on this stuff, you're just getting in the way, right? Consulting its record in other areas tells us that even if these efforts are initially regarded as marginal, they usually do not remain marginal for long. And so they are worth paying very careful attention to. That's all I have. Thanks.